I guess I always knew, deep down, that my stepdad never really saw me as one of his own. There were little signs, things you only notice when you get older and start putting the pieces together. Birthday presents that were cheaper, less thoughtful. Chores piled higher on my plate than on my half-siblings. The way he introduced me at parties not as his son but as my wife's kid. I told myself it didn't matter. That family was about more than blood, more than words. That maybe someday he'd come around. I told myself that for years. Until the night he made it perfectly clear just how wrong I was. It started at the dinner table, as so many bad family memories do. Mom had made her famous lasagna, the one thing that could usually bring peace to even the tensest nights. We were halfway through the meal when the conversation shifted to college. I had just gotten my acceptance letter a few days earlier, a decent state university, nothing fancy, but it meant the world to me. Mom was beaming, proud tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She was halfway through asking about financial aid when my stepdad, Dan, cut her off. He set down his fork with a heavy clink, leaned back in his chair and said, almost lazily, "Not my problem, he's not real family anyway." The words hit the table harder than any fist ever could. The silence that followed was so sharp, so sudden, it made my ears ring. Mom's face crumpled in slow motion. My little brother, Tyler, froze mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air. Even my stepsister, Madison, who normally lived to torment me, went pale. I stared at Dan. At the man who had lived in our house for the past 10 years. The man I had called Dad at school because it was easier than explaining the whole messy situation. The man who had stood next to my mom at every school play, every parent-teacher conference, arms crossed like a silent guard dog. Not real family. The words echoed in my head, bouncing around until they lodged deep, like splinters I couldn't pull out. I pushed my plate away, the food suddenly tasting like ash, and stood up. Mom tried to say something, tried to smooth it over the way she always did, but the damage was done. I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, hollowed out, feeling like someone had reached inside my chest and carved out everything good. For hours I just sat. And somewhere around midnight, as the house went quiet and the last lights flicked off downstairs, a new feeling started to creep in through the numbness. Not sadness. Not even anger. Resolve. Fine. If I wasn't real family, then he wasn't going to get the perks of pretending to be my dad anymore. No more favors. No more help with his endless list of chores. No more loyalty. He had made the rules. I was just going to play by them. And when the opportunity to drive that lesson home finally arrived, when the universe handed me the perfect way to show him what being not real family really meant, I didn't hesitate. I took it with both hands. And I made damn sure he would never forget it. After that dinner, something inside me shifted. It wasn't immediate like flipping a switch. It was slower, heavier, like the slow groaning sound an old door makes before it finally swings shut. Every interaction with Dan after that felt different. Colder. Sharper around the edges. I stopped laughing at his lame jokes. Stopped volunteering to help him when he struggled with something around the house. Stopped trying to earn scraps of approval from a man who had already decided I didn't belong. Mom noticed, of course. She tried to smooth it over, tried to act like it had been a misunderstanding. Dan didn't mean it like that, she said one night, as if those words could somehow unburn the bridge that had gone up in flames. I didn't argue. I didn't yell or accuse. I just nodded and told her I understood. Because I did. I finally understood exactly where I stood. It was weirdly freeing. I poured myself into getting ready for college instead. I applied for every scholarship I could find, scraped together savings from part-time jobs, and worked double shifts when I could. No way was I letting Dan, or his precious definition of real family, hold me back. But resentment is a funny thing. It doesn't just sit quietly in a corner. It grows, festers, until one day it finds an outlet. And mine came one Tuesday afternoon in the most unexpected way. I was standing in the kitchen, sorting through the mail, something I usually did because, surprise, no one else bothered when I found it. A thick, official-looking envelope addressed to my stepdad. From the county office. Curious, I flipped it over and noticed it was marked urgent, property tax notice. Now I wasn't the nosy type, at least not normally, but something about it made me pause. Dan had always bragged about how he had everything handled. About how real men took care of their responsibilities. Yet here was an official warning notice. My gut told me something was off. I set the rest of the mail down and, after a moment of hesitation, carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a bill. A big one. Apparently, Dan hadn't paid the property taxes on the house for almost 2 years. The bill listed thousands in overdue payments, penalties, and a final warning that, if left unpaid, the county could take legal action, up to and including seizing the house. My stomach twisted. Because here's the thing. Technically, the house wasn't just his. After Mom remarried, she had refinanced it to add Dan's name to the title, a move that, at the time, seemed harmless enough. A sign of trust. Family unity. Now that trust was about to bite us all in a very real, very expensive way. And for a second, just a second, I felt the old instinct creep in. The urge to fix it. To protect Mom. To quietly find a way to clean up the mess before it exploded. But then I remembered his words. Not real family. And just like that, any guilt evaporated. This was his responsibility. His name. His mess. I wasn't going to warn him. Wasn't going to save him. I was going to let the consequences land squarely in his lap. The same way he had so casually tossed me aside at the dinner table. But not yet. No, this needed to be done right. A quiet, private reckoning wouldn't be enough. He needed to feel it. Publicly. Undeniably. And when the right moment came, when the pressure built just high enough, I would be ready. I tucked the envelope back into the stack of mail like nothing had happened, wiped my hands on my jeans, and went upstairs. For the first time in a long time, I slept like a rock that night. Because for once, the burden wasn't mine to carry. It was his. And soon, he would know exactly what it felt like. If patience was a skill, then those next few weeks were like my final exam. Every morning I watched Dan shuffle through the mail, clueless that his own doom was sitting there, buried under grocery store flyers and junk ads. He barely even glanced at the official-looking envelopes anymore. Just tossed them on the counter like everything important could wait. He had no idea what was coming. And I wasn't about to remind him. Mom kept bustling around like everything was fine, organizing family dinners, asking about my college prep, pushing for some version of normal that none of us really believed in anymore. And Dan. He acted like nothing had changed. Still gruff. Still bossy. Still tossing little jabs my way whenever he thought Mom wasn't listening. Maybe if you worked harder, you wouldn't need so many scholarships. Kids these days want everything handed to them. Real family supports each other, real sons don't act so entitled. Every comment was like a tiny match, flicked at the growing pile of gasoline between us. But I didn't react. Not outwardly. I nodded. Smiled politely. Played the part of the quiet, obedient stepson. Inside, though. Inside, I was sharpening the knife. The county had given a firm deadline in that letter. If the taxes weren't paid by the end of the next month, legal proceedings would begin. It was all timed perfectly. Right around my high school graduation party. Mom had been planning it for weeks, a big backyard celebration, family flying in from out of town, neighbors invited. The whole works. Dan, of course, had been grumbling about the cost, complaining that college kids don't need parties, and we should save that money for real expenses. But Mom had insisted. "It's a milestone," she said. "He's worked hard, he deserves it." And standing there, watching her defend me, I made a decision. That party would be the moment. It would be poetic. A celebration of my future. An unveiling of his failure. He wouldn't just be exposed, he would be exposed in front of everyone who mattered. There would be no rewriting history. No gaslighting. No sweeping it under the rug. It would be messy. It would be public. And it would be deserved. Over the next few weeks, I made sure everything was ready. I quietly printed a copy of the overdue notice, highlighted the important parts for good measure. I tucked it into a folder nice and neat, and kept it hidden in my backpack. Waiting. Counting down the days. Graduation came and went in a blur. Caps flying. Flashbulbs popping. Hugs from classmates I barely knew. And then, finally, the party. Tables lined up in the backyard. Balloons tied to the fence posts. Coolers filled with sodas and beers for the adults. Family everywhere. Neighbors chatting by the grill. The smell of barbecue thick in the air. And Dan holding court near the patio, beer in hand, laughing loud and fake at every conversation. Playing the role of the proud stepfather like he hadn't poisoned the well months ago. I stayed patient. Waited until the party was in full swing. Until the music was loud enough. Until the chatter was buzzing high. And then, when the timing was perfect, I made my move. I walked up to the table where the gifts were piling up, cards, little boxes, congratulatory notes. I slid the envelope with the tax notice into the stack. Front and center. No name. No warning. Just a very official-looking envelope in a sea of celebration. Then I stepped back and waited. It didn't take long. Dan wandered over, probably hopping to find a card with some cash tucked inside. I watched as he casually rifled through the stack. Watched his face shift from bored to curious to confused as he opened the envelope. And then glorious slow-motion horror, the color drained from his face. He froze there, standing under the string lights, the notice trembling in his hands, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Around him, people started noticing. First Mom, who frowned and walked over. Then Aunt Debbie, craning her neck. Then a few neighbors, their conversations fatting into curious murmurs. "What is it?" Mom asked, voice light but concerned. Dan didn't answer. So I did. Loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Oh," I said with the sweetest, sharpest smile I could manage. "Looks like Dan's been forgetting to pay the property taxes. For a couple of years now. Guess that's something real family would have handled, huh?" The silence that followed was heavy. Sticky. Suffocating. Dan's hand crumpled the paper, his face burning red. But it was too late. The truth was out. And there was no walking it back. For a few long seconds, nobody said anything. It was like the whole backyard froze. The music kept playing from the cheap Bluetooth speaker someone had set up, but even that sounded distant now, thin and meaningless compared to the weight hanging in the air. Dan's hand shook as he clutched the crumpled tax notice, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't know how to spit out. Mom looked from the paper to him, confusion creasing her forehead. She reached out and took the letter from his hands before he could stop her. I watched her eyes move across the page. Watched her mouth tighten into a thin, hard line. When she looked up at Dan, it wasn't confusion anymore. It was betrayal. "What is this, Dan?" she said, her voice trembling but sharp. "You didn't tell me about any of this. You didn't tell me we were behind on the house." He cut her off, waving his hand like he could erase everything if he just moved fast enough. "It's not a big deal," he said, voice too loud, too brittle. "Just a little mix-up, some paperwork got missed, I'm handling it." Handling it. The man couldn't even be bothered to open his mail, but now he was handling it. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. The truth was out, and it was speaking louder than I ever could. Aunt Debbie, never one to miss a chance for drama, stepped closer and peered at the letter in Mom's hand. Late fees, penalties, they can seize the house, she said, her voice full of exaggerated shock. Well, that's not just a little mix-up, Dan. Neighbors whispered behind cupped hands. Cousins shifted awkwardly, pretending to admire the decorations. Even the kids playing on the lawn stopped for a moment, sensing the tension thick in the air. Dan's face was a mess of anger and embarrassment. He looked at me like he wanted to rip the ground out from under my feet. But all he could do was sputter and glare. Because this wasn't my fault. This was his. Mom turned on him again, her voice growing colder by the second. How long have you been lying to me? She said. How could you let this get this bad without saying a word? Dan's mouth flapped uselessly. The strong, gruff man who loved to lecture me about real responsibility and real family looked like a balloon someone had stuck a pin in. He wasn't a pillar. He wasn't a leader. He was a coward, and now everyone knew it. Still, he tried to salvage it. I didn't want to worry you, he said, slipping into that oily, manipulative tone he used when he wanted to smooth things over. It's all under control. I've been talking to the bank. I've got it handled, just a misunderstanding. Mom's hands shook as she folded the letter back into the envelope. But her voice was steady. No, she said. You didn't want to worry me because you didn't want to admit you screwed up. Then she turned to me. And for the first time really looked at me, really saw me, with something more than sadness or guilt. She saw me with pride. This house isn't just your responsibility, she said, her voice breaking a little. It's ours. All of ours. Dan tried to speak again, but Mom shut him down with one sharp glance. Go inside, Dan. For a second I thought he might resist. Might put up some pathetic show of dominance. But he didn't. He slunk away across the yard, shoulders hunched, head down. The strong stepdad act didn't work so well when the mask cracked wide open. The backyard stayed silent for a few beats after he disappeared into the house. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the conversation started up again. Not the same as before. Quieter. Sharper around the edges. People who had once lined up to slap Dan on the back now gave each other pointed looks. People who once laughed a little too hard at his jokes now avoided even glancing toward the house. Mom turned back to me, her face crumpling, but she stayed strong. I'm so sorry, she whispered. You didn't deserve any of this. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I know, Mom, I said quietly, I know. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, I finally felt like I wasn't standing alone. The man who called me not real family had been exposed for exactly what he was. And now it was time to start building something better. Without him, the party wound down faster than anyone expected. Neighbors made quick, awkward goodbyes. Family members gathered their things without lingering for one last piece of cake. Even the kids, still buzzing from sugar and soda, sensed that something heavy had landed over the house and didn't argue when their parents tugged them toward the cars. Within an hour, the backyard was almost empty. Just a few scattered balloons bobbing in the breeze, a forgotten cooler half filled with melted ice, and Mom standing there silently, arms crossed, staring at the back door. I stayed outside, stacking empty plates and folding chairs, pretending to be busy. I didn't want to go in. Not yet. Not until I knew if the storm had passed or if it was still building. Finally, after a long, silent pause, Mom turned to me. Come inside, she said softly. I nodded and followed her through the kitchen, past the table stacked with half-opened gifts, and into the living room where Dan sat slumped on the couch. He didn't even look up when we entered. His face was a mask, part anger, part shame, but mostly exhaustion. I stayed standing. Mom sat down across from him, leaning forward, elbows on her knees. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but there was an edge to it I had never heard before. You humiliated this family today, Dan, she said. You lied to me, you endangered our home, and you disrespected my son. Dan opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but thought better of it. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath I couldn't catch. Mom pressed on. You made it very clear who you consider real family, she said. And now I'm making something clear too. She pulled out a stack of papers from her purse, papers I recognized instantly. Property documents, loan statements, the title to the house. I felt my heart kick against my ribs as she spread them out on the coffee table between them. I talked to a lawyer last week, she said. I had my name separated from the mortgage. Dan finally looked up then, eyes wide, panic flaring. You can't just. I can, Mom said sharply. And I did. She tapped the papers once for emphasis. This house, it's mine now, completely. You're not on it anymore. You have no claim. Dan stared at her like she had slapped him. You can stay here, Mom continued, voice cold as steel. But you'll be paying rent. Real rent. Written contract. Due on the 1st of every month. Or you can leave. Silent. Thick and brutal. For a long time, no one said anything. Finally, Dan found his voice low and bitter. You'd kick me out over him, he spat, jerking his head toward me. Mom stood up. Over you, Dan, she said, towering above him now, her presence filling the room. Over your lies, over your selfishness, over the way you treated the people who actually cared about you. She turned to me then, her eyes softening. You're my family, she said, loud enough for him to hear every syllable. You always have been. I felt something crack open inside me, something old and raw and hurting, and for the first time in years I let myself believe it. I nodded once, unable to speak. Dan sat there, deflating more with every second. There was no fight left in him. He knew he had lost. Not just the argument. Not just the upper hand. The trust. The family. Everything that actually mattered. Mom gathered the papers, tucked them back into her purse, and walked upstairs without another word. Leaving Dan sitting alone on the couch, surrounded by the wreckage he had created. I stayed a moment longer, watching him. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just looked at him, really looked, and saw him clearly for what he was. A man who had built his life on pride and control, and ended up with nothing. Not real family. Not real loyalty. Not even real respect. Just the cold, hollow echo of what could have been. And with that, I turned and followed Mom upstairs, leaving Dan to sit in the silence he had earned. The weeks after the party felt like living in a different house. Same walls. Same rooms. Same creaky front steps and chipped paint on the banister. But everything felt lighter, like someone had opened a window and let all the poison drift out into the world where it belonged. Dan stayed for a little while. He paid the first month's rent, grumbling and dragging his feet like a teenager punished for sneaking out after curfew. But it was obvious he wasn't going to last. He didn't like living under rules he didn't make. Didn't like being treated like a tenant instead of a king. And after everything, Mom wasn't bending anymore. Every time he tried to throw his weight around, about chores, about bills, about anything, Mom would calmly remind him of the terms. You're living here by agreement, Dan. If you don't like it, you know where the door is. The first time she said that, I thought he might actually burst into flames. His face turned a shade of red I'd never seen outside a cartoon. But he didn't argue. Not anymore. Because the power he had counted on for so long, the control he thought was his by right, was gone. And it wasn't just Mom. I was different too. I didn't flinch when he made snide comments under his breath. Didn't scramble to win his approval. Didn't shrink to fit whatever narrow box he thought I belonged in. I was busy preparing for college. Busy living. Busy becoming the kind of person he would never understand. And the more I grew, the smaller he seemed. It wasn't long before the day finally came. A Saturday morning, a month after the party. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the heavy clatter of suitcases thumping down the stairs. Dan appeared in the hallway, dragging 2 battered duffel bags and wearing a scowl that seemed glued to his face. Mom stood at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed, calm as ever. He didn't say goodbye. Didn't apologize. Didn't even look at me. He just yanked the door open, stomped outside, and slammed it shut behind him. I watched through the window as he shoved his stuff into the back of a beat-up pickup truck, climbed in, and peeled out of the driveway without a backward glance. And just like that, he was gone. No dramatic showdown. No shouting match. Just gone. I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. Mom stood beside me at the window, watching the empty road. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she turned, reached out, and squeezed my shoulder. "We're better off," she said quietly. I nodded. Because it was true. The house was quieter now, but not the heavy, miserable quiet from before. It was a peaceful kind of quiet. The kind you could breathe in. The kind that wrapped around you like a warm blanket instead of a chain. Mom smiled more now. Laughed more. Started picking up old hobbies she had abandoned, gardening, painting, even baking ridiculously complicated desserts that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and sugar. And me. I was finally able to focus on my future without the constant weight of wondering if I was enough. I spent that summer getting ready for college, shopping for supplies, filling out paperwork, mapping out my classes. When the day finally came to move into the dorms, Mom was there, beaming and crying at the same time, helping me lug boxes up 3 flights of stairs. No Dan in sight. No bitter shadows hanging over the milestone. Just Mom and me, a real family, standing on solid ground we had fought like hell to reclaim. As she hugged me goodbye, she whispered something that stuck with me. "I'm so proud of the man you're becoming. You did this, you rose above it." I hugged her back fiercely. Because she had risen above it too. We both had. We hadn't just survived the storm. We had outgrown it. And now, standing at the beginning of a brand new chapter, there wasn't a single part of me still chained to the past. Not by guilt. Not by fear. Not by needing approval from people who never really deserved to give it. Dan could call me not real family all he wanted. Because in the end, he wasn't part of the family that mattered. We were. And we always would be. Looking back now, I realize the day Dan walked out wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. For the first time in my life, I got to build something real. Something honest. Without the constant weight of pretending everything was okay when it was. College wasn't easy. I struggled with classes sometimes, with homesickness, with the fear that maybe, deep down, Dan had been right, that maybe I didn't belong anywhere. But every time that doubt crept in, I remembered the look on Mom's face at my graduation party. The strength in her voice when she said I was her family. The pride that no amount of Dan's bitterness could ever erase. And it pushed me forward. I made friends, real ones, people who didn't care where I came from or what my family looked like. People who saw me for who I was, not for the labels someone else tried to stick to me. It was terrifying at first, opening up, trusting again. But it was worth it. Because real family isn't about blood. It's about the people who show up. The people who stay when things get messy and complicated. The people who choose you over and over without conditions. Mom and I rebuilt our little family from the ground up. Holidays became quieter but sweeter. Birthdays meant something again, not because of the gifts, but because of the people around the table, laughing, telling stories, making new memories instead of trying to patch over old wounds. We didn't have a perfect life. But we had a true one. And that made all the difference. Every now and then we'd hear little snippets about Dan, a friend of a friend mentioning he moved to a smaller town, that he was living in a rundown apartment, that he worked odd jobs to make ends meet. I didn't feel angry when I heard it. I didn't feel pity either. I just felt distant. Like hearing about a storm that had passed years ago. Something that once shook the walls of your house, but now was nothing more than a story you tell on a quiet night. Dan had made his choices. And so had we. We chose peace. We chose honesty. We chose each other. I think in the end, that's what real family is all about. It's not about who shares your DNA. It's not about who lives under the same roof. It's about who stands beside you when the ground cracks open. Who lifts you when you're too tired to climb. Who says you're enough and means it not because they have to, but because they want to. Mom chose me. I chose her. And together, we created a family stronger than anything Dan could ever tear apart. Now when I look ahead toward the life I'm building, toward the people I'm bringing into it, I know I'll carry that lesson with me. I'll build my family not by accident, but by intention. By love. By loyalty. By choice. And when people ask me about my past, about the man who once called me not real family, I'll smile and tell them the truth. He was right. We weren't real family. Because real family doesn't abandon you. Real family doesn't make you earn your place. Real family chooses you every damn day. And thanks to him, I learned how to find the ones who actually do.